This is the land as it was when the first Europeans arrived and called it Carolina. It was a land of dense pine forests, stretching from the Atlantic to the Midlands. At the fall line, as the flatness turned to rolling hills, hardwoods appeared in ever greater abundance. The rolling hills became steeper, the valleys deeper into the Piedmont, and finally to the mountains of the Blue Ridge. To the first settlers, Carolina was a hospitable place, a natural greenhouse, where abundant rainfall and a semi-tropical climate encouraged the planting of exotic and valuable crops: indigo, rice, cotton. And as the settlers fanned out from the first population center at Charleston, they realized that this land they called Carolina was one huge watershed, an enormous drainage system for the southeastern section of the American continent. To the surprise of the early settlers, and even to Americans of today, this Carolina watershed is one of the largest east of the Mississippi River. But it was not only the size of the watershed that surprised the settlers. It was the potential use of Carolina's rivers that intrigued them as well. From an early time, before the American Revolution, visionary Carolinians dreamed of a transportation system using these rivers, the Santee and the Cooper, linked by a canal that would enable shipping from the Piedmont and Midlands to the great port of Charleston.
There were those who considered such grand dreams, such grand schemes, to be a little less than great folly. Nevertheless, under the leadership of Revolutionary War heroes, General William Moultrie, John Rutledge, who attended the Constitutional Convention, General Francis Marion, and General Thomas Sumter, construction on the Santee Canal began in 1793, with 10 men armed with picks and shovels.
By the time of its completion in 1800, crews averaging 700 men had spent 7 years of their lives, many giving their lives, to carve a 22-mile corridor through solid limestone and malaria-infested swamps, all in an attempt to connect the Midlands with Charleston. And it worked. In 1801, a Charleston newspaper announced the arrival of William Buford, who lived 90 miles above Columbia on the Broad River. He had traveled from the upcountry to the coast completely by water, a trip which meant the time and expense of overland shipping had been cut in half. But here, history and technology intervened. No one could have foreseen the development of the chugging little railroad as an even faster and less expensive alternative. Nor could they have predicted the seasonal droughts which left the canal dry for weeks, even months on end. The canal worked when it worked, that is, when it rained. But it was almost immediately obsolete. By 1850, the canal was so seldom used that the legislature revoked its charter. The great dream for inland navigation came to pass, and like a dream, faded. And then, the Civil War, and the long days of Reconstruction, of poverty, of near ruin for Carolina. At the outset of the American Revolution, South Carolina was the wealthiest state in the nation. By 1865, the poorest. And as the nation marched with optimism into the 20th century, its cities loud with the noise of trolleys and motor cars, the entire fabric of our society was rapidly changing with the new high-speed transportation, communications and power resources to light homes, factories, and stores. In South Carolina, this new optimism emerged in the form of the Columbia Railway and Navigation Company. Chartered in 1913, this Midlands-based trade company ran a regular steamship service between Columbia and Georgetown. But these heavy-laden steamships were encountering rough waters and navigational hazards, particularly at the mouth of the Santee River. Then, the port of Georgetown was closed to commercial use during World War I, and an alternate route had to be found. Enter Thomas Clay Williams, the little man with the big idea. Williams was a partner in the steamship company. It was Williams who remembered the old canal. The story that had been so long forgotten, it had passed into legend. It was Williams who went into the wilderness and traced the old canal with its locks, and braved the laughter and scorn of the business community, a fate far more dangerous than the malarial mosquitoes he encountered in the swamps. It was T.C. Williams who finally demonstrated that the 35-foot drop between the Santee and the Cooper was more than enough to generate much-needed electric power for the state. His persistence over a full decade finally paid off. In 1926, he was granted a Federal Power Commission license to build a new Santee Canal. Williams also brought industry to the state, most particularly the International Paper Company, which purchased the Railway and Navigation Company. And then the Depression brought a screeching halt to economic growth of any kind. The reality of the Depression interrupted the dream of a new canal, of usable inland navigation, and of electric power for all the people of South Carolina. A new, dark age had fallen. By 1930, electrification in South Carolina was concentrated in the urban areas. By comparison to other states, much of South Carolina was still in darkness. To really understand conditions in the state at the turn of the early 20th century, one had only to look at the facts and figures. The Great Depression that began for the nation with the stock market collapse in 1929 had really begun for South Carolinians a decade earlier, with the collapse of cotton prices at the end of World War I. From 1920 to 1935, fully 80% of the young men who graduated from high school and college left the state. The value of all segments of the economy declined sharply. Manufactured cotton goods by 1/3, mineral products by 63%, timber by 68%. Throughout the state, unemployment was high, while public health was at a low ebb. Deaths from malaria ran at an alarming 16 people per 100,000. Grim as it was, rural counties of the Low Country were worse off, a desperate area. Greenville journalist Harry Ashmore wrote, "The march of progress and civilization has left in its wake decaying mansions, specters now of a more glorious day, silent and vacant in their watch over lands where once their masters reaped crops of large return, of indigo and rice. For South Carolina, times had seldom, if ever, been worse. And then, in 1932, a first light for South Carolina's rural people appeared. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York, was running for president. At the Chicago Convention, Roosevelt's people met with members of the South Carolina delegation who presented the idea of a canal linking the Santee and Cooper rivers and an electric generating station that would supply power to areas of the South Carolina low country. The idea was met with enthusiasm by the candidate, and during the presidential campaign, Roosevelt talked about the need for public power projects all over the nation.
The natural hydroelectric power resources belonging to the people of the United States or the several states shall remain forever in their possession.
One of the South Carolinians who attended that convention and met with the Roosevelt people was Richard M. Jeffries, then a senator from Colleton County and an early advocate of the project. Jeffries presented the original plan in the South Carolina Senate and served as general counsel during the lengthy litigation which followed. Charleston Mayor Burnett R. Maybank also attended the Chicago meetings in 1932 and returned home to join the fight to help the people of South Carolina. In 1933, after Roosevelt's election, a small group of state legislators, among them a young senator from Edgefield named Strom Thurmond, sponsored a bill creating a public power corporation. Overwhelmingly passed in the Senate, the bill was defeated in the House. But throughout the summer of '33, supporters of the bill canvassed the state. Committees were formed. Editorials supporting the project appeared. When the General Assembly convened the next year, a delegation was sent to Washington to work out details with the administration. The enabling legislation was passed in the South Carolina General Assembly on April 7, 1934, creating the South Carolina Public Service Authority, whose purpose was to construct and operate the Santee Cooper hydroelectric and navigation project. The legislation established the state-owned utility as a corporation completely owned by and to be completely operated for the benefit of the people of South Carolina, for the improvement of their health, welfare, and material prosperity. No state money was to be spent nor obligated. Construction funds were to come entirely from federal grants and federally backed loans. The license granted to T.C. Williams in 1926 was obtained from the Columbia Railway and Navigation Company, and this centuries-old dream was about to come true. But then, another delay. Privately owned utilities in the state filed suit to block construction, saying the project would cost far more than estimated, that it was unsound geologically, and that it would actually harm the people of South Carolina.
Finally, in the late spring of 1939, the legal hurdles were cleared.
Land clearing began on 171,000 acres to create two mammoth lakes. The lakes would be formed by impounding the Santee River after 42 miles of dams and dikes had been built, and construction got underway. At Pinopolis, a 26-mile-long dike was built with local sand and clay, excavated from under the swamp muck which had stood for 1,000 years. Also at Pinopolis, the hydro station and navigation lock, the highest single-lift lock in the world. 60 feet wide and 180 feet long, to lift barges 75 feet from the tail race canal at the base of the dam to the surface of the lower lake. Down the tail race 4 miles away flowed the Cooper River, running to the sea. The switchyard was located on the banks of the tail race, next to the hydro station, focal point of the transmission system for electricity generated by Santee Cooper. Over on the Santee, controlling floodwaters with an 8-mile-long earthen dam with its 3,400-foot spillway, 62 massive gates could be lifted by gantry cranes, allowing for the controlled release of excess water to maintain proper lake levels. At the same time, Santee Cooper purchased existing generating stations and lines to fulfill its mission to distribute low-cost electricity directly to customers in Berkeley, Horry, and Georgetown counties. It was a project of tremendous proportion, greater at the time than any state could afford. Its cost, $31 million, was 5 times the state's 1934 budget. All funds came from federal grants and loans, not 1 cent from the state. But though the money came from Washington, the heart of Santee Cooper was in South Carolina. The 2 mammoth lakes were named for Governor William Moultrie and General Francis Marion, 2 of the men whose vision helped build the original Santee Canal. And the hydro station was named for Richard M. Jeffries, the state senator who presented the plan in the Senate. Jeffries later served as governor of South Carolina and also became the 2nd general manager of Santee Cooper in 1943. Bernard R. Maybank, the former Charleston mayor, became Santee Cooper's first chairman of the board. His support for the project continued throughout his life, including the time he served as governor of the state. And in addition to these believers in the dream, the efforts and accomplishments of thousands of South Carolinians also came into play. First, the men. Now with jobs, some for the first time in 10 years, who cleared the land of trees and brush, who ran the earth-moving machines, scraping out the lakes, piling the dirt and sand for dams, pouring the concrete. The engineers constructing the giant dams, the hydro station, the locks and the gantries. They were housed in special camps with mess halls and barracks and entertainment centers like an army. And the rural families, displaced by rising waters. Whole towns had to be relocated. What might have been a terrible time of displacement for families who lived on the same patch of land for 200 years became instead a windfall in many cases, for some obtained even more land than they had before. It was also a giant leap forward for public health in South Carolina. Malaria was virtually wiped out. Surveys taken when the project started revealed a full 80% of the school children in the area had contracted the disease. Most of the lower part of the state was declared to be in the serious or very serious range. Notices went up in public buildings warning people to try not to be bitten by mosquitoes. But the South Carolina Health Department, the Public Health Service, and Santee Cooper itself joined forces to fight this killer. Using sophisticated siphons and drainage systems to rid the area of standing water, the mosquito's breeding ground, and various insecticides, malaria was kept under strict control. In fact, Not only did reports of cases decrease among the population of the Low Country, but few, if any, of the project workers contracted the disease, and they were right there in the thick of it. In just 2.5 years, from the start of the clearing to the damming of the Santee, over 171,000 acres cleared, 42 million cubic yards of earth moved, 3 million yards of concrete poured, and in February of 1942, Santee Cooper generated its first electricity. 6 months later, all 5 power plant units at Pinopolis were in service, and power was being delivered to 2 key defense industries in Charleston, for we were now at war, and that was the first priority of the nation. For all the people, it was a time of hope, of rebirth. In 1930, these areas, chiefly around urban centers of the state, were provided with electric power. Since 1942 and the opening of Santee Cooper, electrification in South Carolina had jumped from 3 to 92% in the state's rural areas. For in addition to supplying power directly to customers in the northeast corner of the state, Santee Cooper was supplying power to military and industrial installations, and to 15 of the state's 20 electric cooperatives, bringing power to over 2/3 of South Carolina. This, then, is Santee Cooper, one of the greatest accomplishments and one of the greatest resources of South Carolina. A state-owned utility operating for the betterment of all the state's people. Today, the resource that is Santee Cooper continues to fulfill its original mission to provide lower electric rates for South Carolinians. One evidence of this is that while Santee Cooper is one of the largest public power utilities in America, its income from electricity ranks it much lower. And Santee Cooper provides the citizens of South Carolina with a public power yardstick by which they can measure the cost and the services provided by all electric utilities. Santee Cooper has grown as the state has grown, to match the needs of a growing dynamic area. By providing low electric rates and aggressively seeking new business, to help South Carolina obtain necessary industry for jobs, for economic health, Santee Cooper and the state's electric co-ops have helped to improve the quality of life for the people of the state. By managing its resources wisely, Santee Cooper has provided almost endless recreational opportunities on its lakes for all South Carolinians. And through environmental care and research in aquaculture and horticulture, the utility provides new resources to the state. Flood control had now been accomplished on the Santee, where in ages past, the river overflowed its banks an average of 9 times a year, destroying land and property. Good farmland is now tilled. And navigation, the crux of the early dream, is now possible from Columbia to Charleston. The vision of a route to the sea, the dream of water and power, the challenge of fulfilling that dream the reality of Santee Cooper. All this was done by South Carolinians who dreamed it, who built it, who made it happen. And with Santee Cooper, they worked the miracle. The miracle of public power owned by the people of South Carolina. The miracle of pushing back the darkness.